Hello and welcome one and all to another edition of Taking Out the Trash. I apologize ahead of time if you hear yard work going on in the background. One of my neighbors scheduled their yard work for today at this time. I, of course, didn't know that would happen. I think they're getting near the end though, so hopefully that sound should clear up soon. How's everybody doing? I want to make sure everybody can hear me before I jump into today's wonderful article brought to us by the Daily Beast. Can everybody hear me? Holler if you hear me, in the words of Scott Steiner. Alright. That being said, let us take a look at today's article. It is from the Daily Beast. So, last time we were looking at a right-wing rag called Washington Times. This time we're looking at least what was a left-wing rag. I guess it sort of still is, although it is pretty low tier on the left. I mean, this is definitely a few steps below something like Jacobin or something of that nature, which sometimes has some intellectual heft to it. The title of the article had me confused. It is, Donald Trump Isn't Julius Caesar, He's Republic Killer Tiberius Gracchus. And the reason why that confuses me is that typically a lot of people will just skip straight to the person they think that Trump is if they're comparing him to a Roman, and they won't bother to qualify that he isn't someone else, and they will give that person's role to another politician. And since the Caesar comparison, as we all know, is so common, or actually Caesar to anybody. I mean, Caesar's been compared with Obama and pretty much every other modern politician just because he's the one Roman that's more or less universally known. So at first I'm like, okay, this is promising. Donald Trump isn't Julius Caesar. Correct. He's Republic Killer Tiberius Gracchus. Now immediately, not only do I have a lot of objections that we'll get to because there aren't really any parallels between Tiberius Gracchus and Trump, but also even the detractors of Tiberius Gracchus, the people who say that he undermined the Republic's values, that he really undermined the solidity of the ruling class, and maybe introduced degeneracy, whatever the case might be, none of them really called him a Republic killer, because even if you think that he was a corrosive influence, it was still almost 100 years before the Republic fell. So it's really hard to make the argument that in 1 year as Tribune, he and he alone undermined the foundation of the Republic. So, yeah, it's a bizarre article, and it's a bizarre argument. So then I'm thinking, well, it's the Daily Beast, so they're almost always on the left, but the argument that Tiberius Gracchus undermines the legitimacy and morality of the Republic is a very typically right-wing argument, if not even far-right argument. So there's a lot going on in the title, so I was immediately taken by this. And by the way, this led me down a bit of a rabbit hole to figure out what we're dealing with here. I have not actually read the article yet, but I did do a bit of background research into the author, Max Burns. Because I'm like, well, maybe he's their resident Republican, their token guy. But no, not at all. He is a Democratic strategist. He works at a place called Millennial Politics. He appears on Fox, but he also goes on Bloomberg. And by the way, not to be a dick, but usually if you see somebody who is a Democratic strategist and they go on a network which leans right, they're there to look bad and lose the argument. It's the same way that places like MSNBC tend to only bring on Republicans who are either dumb or have the charisma of burnt toast. You're there to get your ass kicked to make the other party look better. That's why they paired Hannity with Combs. Combs actually was not dumb, but he didn't really make super clever arguments, and he also had very little charisma. So even when he made a decent point, he'd just get shouted down by his co-host and the always Republican guest. And then so viewers would be like, yeah, the liberals got owned. So that's just an age-old formula, and I can't help but to imagine, based on this article, that Max Burns most likely is of that caliber. But if we look at his articles, we can see that, he takes a fairly standard Democratic line. He seems to be a little bit more left of center than a lot of Democratic columnists, so he's not defending Manchin, Sinema, or Biden too much, and he does purport to be a supporter of AOC, as we can see here. But clearly, based on what we're seeing in this other article, he's probably not an intellectual heavyweight, to put it lightly. And as I said, I highly suspect that he is on these programs to be a sacrifice on the altar of Republican greatness. So, the subtitle also shows what I believe to be one of the major problems with this, but again, of course, we'll find out if I'm right based on this initial assessment. What made him so dangerous was his determined incitement of the worst and most violent tendencies of his populist mob. So, Tiberius Gracchus did not incite violence in his mobs. He actually really had no mob. He did use the assembly to pass legislation, but he never incited violence. His brother went further than Tiberius, but also did not incite violence. When there was a violent mob which rose up, it was roused by the Senate, mostly of wealthy people who the Senate convinced would be in danger of losing their land to Tiberius, and then they broke up benches to get cudgels, and they beat him and some of his supporters to death. That was the mob violence. And what I suspect is that, just like a whole lot of Democrats after 2016, Max Burns has an extraordinarily limited understanding of populism in American history. Populism was historically more on the left than on the right. And by the way, it doesn't necessarily have to be left or right. You can have left and right populists. Those things are not contradictions. Trump is kind of a right populist stylistically, or at least he was in 2016. By 2020, not as much. Bernie Sanders is a left populist, and he's actually more in line with the populist tradition. So that's one of those weird things that emerged after 2016, because they had to say that Trump is the worst thing ever. So if Trump is a populist, therefore populism is the worst thing ever, and it's clearly right-wing, and Trump is operating in an international tradition / movement, where you also have Erdogan of Turkey, the guy in Hungary whose name eludes me at the moment, and other right-wing populists who have become internationally prominent. The guy in the Philippines, the Brazilian leader. So what that ignores, though, is that America has had its own particular history with populism, and that it is not always right-wing. In fact, quite the opposite. So those are my initial thoughts just looking at the title and subtitle. Let's see if his article is any different or better than what I suspect. It's kind of more exciting to take a risk like this, at least I find, because, you know, there's no pain, no gain. All right. As Americans try to find familiarity in strange times, people have grasped at a sea of comparisons to try and fully capture Trump's innate Trumpiness. Alright, we're starting out with a touch of cringe here, but he is correct that people have made a lot of very absurd comparisons to try to make Trump make sense rather than trying to understand him in his own terms. So I will give him credit for that. His framing so far is basically right. Our most analogized president has been compared to Hitler and Stalin. Why not Hitler, Stalin? Because they're pretty different on a lot of key areas. Jesus, a chess grandmaster, and Julius Caesar. I have not seen the comparisons to Jesus, but I am tempted to click on the hyperlink because that sounds absurd. Also, a chess grandmaster, that actually might be even more absurd. Because if anything, Trump is the kind of guy who goes with his gut. A chess grandmaster is pretty much all logos, whereas Trump is pretty much all pathos. So that's literally the opposite. And Jesus was kind of ascetic. He talked about humility and helping one's fellow man. And he had close friends who respected him. So if anything, the Jesus and the chess grandmaster analogies are way more off the wall than, say, Caesar, who at least was a politician and put his ambition ahead of other things, or Hitler and Stalin, who were power-hungry dictators. Although I think that it is rather unfair to Trump to compare him to Hitler or Stalin, given that they have body counts in the tens of millions. So, yeah, that's a bit of an exaggeration. And using Hitler or Stalin as an example, unless somebody has a pretty significant body count, really just shows a poverty of historical understanding. The Daily Beast, Clive Irving, likened Trump to an early-stage Mussolini. That argument I actually do agree with, largely. I think that if you had to compare Trump to a 20th century dictator or to a figure from fascism, it would be Mussolini. They also have a lot of the same facial expressions, and Mussolini was also known for being a bit lazy, prone to delegate, and not nearly as repressive or systematic as other fascist dictators. So, actually, yeah, I think the Trump-Mussolini comparison might be one that's actually worthwhile. Frank Palmieri at Alternet countered, Trump is no Mussolini, he's Charles II of England. No. I'll have to look at that article too, because that sounds fascinating. I'm really curious about that. I mean, Charles II actually had a following, and there were people who had been around him and dealt with him, who followed him in some pretty dark times. Trump, he doesn't really have people who have spent time with him, who aren't related to him, who are willing to stay the course with him for the most part. Because he's not the kind of guy who really inspires loyalty in those who actually know him. And also, he's not representing a specific order or worldview. Trump represents himself, by and large. And that's about it. But we've seen this before, over 2,000 years ago, when another insurgent faux populist movement whipped disaffected citizens into an anti-establishment frenzy. Okay, so the citizens who rallied to Tiberius Gracchus were not all disaffected. There were some of them who had lost their land and wanted to get it back so that way they could participate more fully in the benefits of Roman citizenship. A lot of what Tiberius was talking about was trying to restore land to people so that way the military could recruit. Because Roman recruitment in that period was based on land ownership, and land was becoming more and more concentrated in fewer and fewer hands, which meant that soldiers were getting used over and over, while there were lots of men in cities who weren't eligible for military service and whose primes were being completely wasted. So the Roman army was becoming less ready over time and less capable. This was at a time when Rome had no serious threat to it, but the Romans were beginning to notice that their army was not the ass-kicking machine of the immediate post-Second Punic War period, and they were trying to figure out what to do about it. So Tiberius' solution is let's spread the bird more widely like it used to be spread, and that way we'll have a deeper manpower pool, and also we will cut down on crowding in Rome, because the Agri Publicus, the public land from Rome's conquest of Italy, this land was originally designated as being in reserve. But what had happened is that rich people had just, especially senators, had just started putting their shit there and claiming it without having any legal title to it. So there were some people who were other senators who actually backed Tiberius Gracchus. It wasn't just Tiberius and a bunch of pissed off people who had lost their land. There actually were some prominent backers. Appius Claudius Pulcher, one of the most aristocratic of the Romans, a former consul, and I believe Tiberius' father-in-law. Or maybe he joined with Gaius, I can't remember which one, but there were some very prominent people on Tiberius' side. Also keep in mind, Tiberius himself came from one of the most noble families in Rome. His father and grandfather had been great men. In fact, his grandfather had been one of the dictators during the Second Punic War, a guy who won a great deal of acclaim in Rome's darkest hour. So he was the master of horse, I believe, in 215, when Rome was really on the ropes, and he helped to win some small victories that enabled Rome to survive the post-Cannae storm. And then Tiberius' father was a man renowned for his virtue, and Tiberius' mother was the daughter of Scipio Africanus. So Tiberius himself was the inheritor of again, one of the most noble bloodlines in Rome, and he himself identified very much as an aristocrat. He conducted himself with the utmost dignity. As a speaker, he tried to not show emotion or appeal to anything that might be considered crass. And his dignity and bearing was something that his opponents found difficult to deal with, because they wanted to paint him as being a wild-eyed crazy person because he wanted to take away some of their land to fix Rome's recruitment issues. But it was hard to, because Tiberius was a very dignified, distinguished gentleman with an impeccable pedigree equal to or greater than their own. The echoes of his worldview can be heard nearly a century before Caesar's rise, when Tiberius Gracchus convinced Roman citizens to hollow out their governing institutions. That's not what he was arguing, though. What he was arguing is using the ager publicus as it was designed. And he was arguing that, as the Romans had done prior to the Second Punic War, they could pass legislation through the legislative assemblies. Tiberius Gracchus was actually making a conservative case for reform. As for Trump, he's not directly arguing about hollowing out institutions. Trump really doesn't have a clear ideology. His ideology twists and shifts based on where he thinks he's going to find support. Now, he's not the only egotist in American politics by a country mile, but with Trump, it is very clear, especially if you look at the way he's changed since he came into office, that his ideology is very much dependent on where the opportunity is. He also is clever enough to know that even though there are Republican pipe dreams about gutting Social Security, that would lose a bunch of support and seats, so he doesn't do stuff like that. Trump has no real set principles. There is no North Star for Donald Trump. Tiberius Gracchus was trying to basically restore the pre-Second Punic War constitution in many ways. There was a lot of consistency with Tiberius's worldview, none with Trump's. Tiberius Gracchus was born around 169 BC, a richly privileged outsider in a time of declining public trust and a divided and weak Roman Senate. Actually, most of that decline in the public trust occurred after Tiberius's time, and largely because of the Senate's actions toward Tiberius and his brother Gaius. Up to that point, people thought that the Senate was a responsible body. It had guided them through the Second Punic War. It had helped build a Mediterranean-wide empire. A lot of people had faith that the Senate would do the right thing, that they would overcome this crisis. Because the senators at least professed to be part of a meritocracy which sought to seek the best for the Senate and people of Rome. But when push came to shove and Tiberius presented them with a plan that would benefit all of the Roman people with a fairly mild sacrifice from a handful of senators, they went apeshit. They literally roused a mob up against him of their well-off supporters or some people who are willing to work for pay, got them worked up into a white-hot fury, and then they went after Tiberius and his supporters. And Tiberius had the opportunity to fight back. Some of his supporters said, "We'll fight these guys in the streets." Tiberius said, "No, that would undermine the integrity of the Republic." So that's why Tiberius didn't put up much of a fight, and he and his supporters got crushed. Early in his life, Tiberius recognized the Roman government lacking in resolve, bound by archaic norms and customs that pointlessly impeded real progress. He would change that. I don't know that he really felt that way at first. He went to the Senate before he went to the people with his proposals. He thought that because of his observations and the case he was building, that they would see reason. And in fact, there had been people arguing effectively what Tiberius had been saying for a while. A decade or so before him, Gaius Laelius the Younger had made a similar proposal in the Senate, and then his colleagues had said, "No, that is not wise. We don't like that." So he backed off, and then they called him Gaius Laelius Sapiens, Gaius Laelius the Wise, because they decided that it was more important that they keep their land and like each other than that Rome have a functioning military, or that the Roman people gain from their empire in any meaningful way. So it wasn't really an archaic norms and customs problem. It was the problem of all the decisions in Rome being made by a small body of 300 men and their most prominent supporters, all of whom shared the same interest, but all of their collective interest was at the expense of the rest of the citizen body. And ultimately, they decided to embrace consensus over making any kind of reforms, whether that is reverting to what Tiberius Gracchus wanted, which was to revert to the older way of doing things, or to make some institutional changes for a new system. They decided to hold the line, and what that led to were a few decades of turmoil where tribunes would kind of imitate Gracchus, but with less principles because they knew that the Senate would be out to get them. And then we have a social war where one of the other lines the Senate decided to hold was against granting citizenship to the Italians who would get drafted in the Roman armies, sent out to die, and then when they came home, sometimes their land would be confiscated and given to Romans. So they revolted eventually. The Romans had to eventually cede citizenship, as people had been calling for years. Then, after that, there was a civil war in the 80s between Sulla and Marius, which was largely over some related issues. So, yeah, I mean, Tiberius, if anything, attempted to set the Roman state on a positive course, and his reforms, had they taken place, might have given Rome a few decades of good government before they needed another set of reforms to keep going. Alright, I'm curious about where this weird quote comes from. I'm not going to read this excerpt here until we get to it, but comparing Sean Hannity and Plutarch, that's brain-breaking. I'm going to have to scroll past this because I can't look at this and still have a logical thought. That is fucking stupid. One of Tiberius's first notable public acts involved illegally negotiating and signing a peace treaty with the troublesome Numantines. Rome's treaty agreements were deeply ritualized events normally overseen by legates, the Republic's senior officials. No. Treaty agreements were normally overseen by the consuls in the Senate. The consuls are the senior magistrates. The legates are subordinate generals who serve under praetors and consuls. I mean, what? Okay, the Numantine Treaty was in Spain, of course. The Romans had a long-term involvement there. And Tiberius, I believe, was acting as a representative of his cousin Scipio Aemilianus at this time. And he would have been a legate, which is one of the more junior positions, because you don't even have to have served in the Senate as a quaestor to be a legate. Basically, all you need is money and connections, and you can become a legate. You could even be an ex-consul as a legate, or you could be some guy who is 25 and has never been elected to a public office before. As long as the general appoints you, you're good. But that is just not correct. Tiberius did not go rogue on that. And his actions were praised for the most part when he did this. Also, interestingly enough, if you're going to condemn Tiberius for doing something like this, what about his ideological opposite, at least in theory, at least the way it tends to be framed now, Sulla? Sulla went behind the back of his commander Marius to end the war in Numidia by capturing Jugurtha, by working with the king of the Mauritanians. And people would call Sulla a war hero. But technically he disobeyed Marius. And then he took credit for the operation when normally the tradition was that credit goes to the commander-in-chief. So Tiberius getting some of the credit for doing a lot of the legwork, how's that undermining the Republic? But yet Sulla, who did a much more brazen version of this without his commander's approval, is then seen as a champion of the Republic. I mean, that's special pleading at its absolute worst. And we also have to remember that neither of these things is all that shocking. The Roman system is a competitive political system. Roman young Romans always tried to distinguish themselves through one means or another. While they did work together on foreign operations, they always tried to stand out individually. So, in this case, neither Tiberius nor Sulla really did anything that was beyond the pale. Now, maybe it's not great for discipline and it's not ideal, but it's hard to really look at it as illegal or something that's a real scandal. Tiberius's boldness sparked a scandal, not unlike that of a president installing his son-in-law in a sensitive diplomatic role over well-qualified career civil servants. Those two things are not at all comparable. Not in the least comparable. I mean, if you wanted to go back to your colleague's observation that Trump is similar to Mussolini, Mussolini did the same exact thing with his son-in-law. His son-in-law was his chief diplomat. And ironically, kind of like Jared Kushner, he might have low-key been Mussolini's best person. So, yeah, it's kind of one of those things where these similarities just simply don't exist if you're looking at Tiberius Gracchus and Trump. Tiberius's stunning lack of respect. He observed all the forms. He literally went through the legal channels as they existed in the Roman Constitution, such as it was. He first went to the Senate out of respect for his colleagues. When they shot his proposals down, he went to the people, as was his right as a tribune of the people, and in accordance with Roman law. For fundamental Roman values caused a shockwave among Roman elites. The fundamental Roman value was one that was only about 90 years old, and that was the fundamental value that the Senate just decides everything, and the people's power is purely theoretical. That was the value that he violated. And the reason he did so is because he saw that this reform would help Rome. It would put Rome on a right footing going forward. Again, Tiberius recently served. He had been in the Numantine War, and he had ridden through the Italian countryside and seen that a lot of small farmers were getting ousted from their land and bought out by bigger farmers who couldn't possibly make up for the lack of military service that those small farmers were providing. Plutarch, oh wait, and we're not quite there yet, but Tiberius, far from the capital, had built support among rank-and-file soldiers in the working class. Citation needed. Now, a lot of Romans had support among the soldiers, and the soldiers, as I mentioned, were effectively coterminous with the working class. Sort of the working, the middle class, even. Actually, the very poorest people would not have been soldiers, as I mentioned, because you have to own land to be drafted at this period, before Marius. So, Tiberius, by doing well in war, had earned respect among people who had served with him, but we shouldn't think that he was yet a household name. Now, his family had name recognition, but he wasn't the most famous person in Rome. And if anything, the person with the most prestige in 133 was his cousin Scipio Aemilianus, who, while seemingly reform-minded up to this point, would basically say that Tiberius got what he deserved because Scipio Aemilianus, in the end of his life, decided that he was more of, he would rather be praised by his senatorial colleagues to do the right thing. Plutarch, the dutiful Sean Hannity of his day. What? Is Sean Hannity dutiful? What's he dutiful to? Sean Hannity's just a hack. Plutarch was not only a biographer, but also someone who was concerned with moral philosophy. He was a great librarian. He was a local politician in the small city of Chaeronea. He was a Roman citizen. He served as an ambassador a few times. Plutarch is the exact opposite of Sean Hannity. Plutarch is much more analogous with Cornel West or Noam Chomsky or someone who's a very well-known public intellectual. And then his lives of eminent men, eminent Greeks and Romans, this is effectively his popular history public outreach effort. And Plutarch, I've critiqued him in the past, he's not the best historian, but he is a polymath. He's great at a whole lot of things, and we're indebted to his lives, because those give us a lot of details of many Greeks and Romans that we otherwise would not have. But he's nothing like Sean Hannity, and he does not engage in rank partisanship the way that Sean Hannity does. That's just not at all what Plutarch does. Plutarch looks at both the positive and negative of both Gracchi brothers. And in fact, he's relatively critical of Gaius Gracchus, at least, Tiberius' younger brother. So the idea that Plutarch is sort of like an ancient right-winger and he's a cheerleader for the Gracchi brothers, that's just stupid. That's not all accurate. I mean, Plutarch did not conceive of things in a strictly partisan manner because, again, he wrote quite a bit later, in the 1st and 2nd century CE, so the Republic was dead by then, and he was Greek. He did not necessarily see Rome through the lens of optimates versus populares, at least not in the same way that subsequent scholars did. Plutarch's view is much more focused on, or at least his focus is much more on the personal morals of the people that he covers. He's one of those guys that's obsessed with issues of character, because again, Plutarch is a moral philosopher first and foremost. Sean Hannity is concerned about the parenthetical letter after your name, and that's about it. If you have an R after your name, you're basically a saint. If you have a D after your name, you're basically a demon. I mean, that's how Sean Hannity sees the world. Plutarch was more concerned with virtue and vice. And he also was concerned with things like courage, which I guess would fall into the category of virtue, and what these people thought, and how they behaved towards others, and things of that nature. Plutarch's politics don't really make sense in a partisan environment, and I doubt that if he had been, I bet if he had been in a competitive political environment, he actually would not have been very successful, because Plutarch doesn't seem to have much of an edge to him, and I don't get the impression that he would have been a very effective political knife fighter. But anyway, those are just my random thoughts there. What made Tiberius so dangerous was his determined incitement of the worst, most violent tendencies of his populist mob. Again, Tiberius did not incite his mob to violence. And his mob wasn't really a mob. It was just a group of people who wanted to vote according to their own interest and what they thought was best for Rome. And again, among his supporters were some prominent senators. It was not Gracchus versus the entire Senate. It was Gracchus with some senators versus another block of senators, and then their immediate circle. People who were willing to cudgel their social peers in order to appease their masters and get fed. On returning home from military service, Tiberius began swinging his institutional wrecking ball at Roman politics. Again, his first attempt was to work through the Senate using persuasion. He didn't go in with the intention of wrecking the Senate, and he also did not expect and was absolutely shocked by just how hard the Senate dug in its heels. He might have been a little too young to remember Laelius and his attempt, but also Tiberius might simply have not really understood why Laelius was called the wise. Or at least he thought that maybe wisdom isn't being a complete craven coward. Maybe he had a slightly grander vision of the world. I don't know. Crazy. As one of the first leaders of the populares, does not mean favoring people, by the way. Populares means something like using popular support. And that term was invented as a pejorative. Well, actually, no, it became a pejorative later. Started out as a pejorative, then became a popular term. And then what would happen is that the two factions would try to compete to say who was the real popularis. So actually, the optimates, when they gave speeches, they identified as the true populares, at least on a later date. But this term is somewhat anachronistic. It really doesn't. That term does not become a popular term used for this faction until nearly 50 years later, after Tiberius. This is a term that is very much part of the late Republic politics rather than
Tiberius' time, which is the boundary between the Middle and Late Republic. But the populares do recruit Tiberius' memory as sort of their founding father, if you will. That being said, if you went to Tiberius and said, "Oh, you're a popularis," he'd say, "What the fuck is that? I don't know what that means." Tiberius homed voters justifiable disconnection and anger into a lethal political blade. The problem is here, Mr. Max Burns, you basically, if you're making this comparison that Trump and Tiberius are the same, if you think that the voters have justifiable disconnection and anger, then you're giving credence to the Trump supporters. And I know that's almost certainly not your intention, given that looking at your articles is basically rah-rah Democrats, Republicans are bad. Wording matters. And you only publish an article every couple of weeks, so it's not as if you don't have time to edit this kind of stuff. But based on the way that you phrase this, you just gave the Trump people an easy win. Congratulations. You can't even do hackery right. Okay, so Tiberius' voters, we haven't even gotten to what their grievance is. I've stated it, but Max Burns has not. He's just focused on Tiberius supposedly really getting people riled up. And also, this kind of argument, ironically enough, is the exact kind of argument that people used to use on the right to denounce Martin Luther King. They say that he's just getting people worked up. And they wouldn't ask, is it justified? They just say, oh, he's getting people riled up. They wouldn't ask, is this a justifiable cause? Does he have right on his side? Is he within his rights to say and do these things? It'd be, no, it must be bad. People are getting excited over it. And I know that also cannot possibly be Max Burns' angle here, but he is, I guess in this case, ironically reproducing the same logic utilized by people who defended segregation. So it looks like we're going to talk about forever wars. Maybe actually he knows a little bit more than I gave him credit for. Let's find out. Nothing was stable in Tiberius' Rome. The Republic had been lurching from one military crisis to the next for nearly a century. Sort of. I mean, Rome's wars at this time were elective by and large. I mean, the wars they fought in Macedonia and Greece were sort of in revenge for the Second Macedonian War when Philip V jumped in at the height of the Second Punic War. But beyond that, these were wars of acquisition that Rome fought at its leisure. And early on, part of it was to take advantage of the huge number of highly experienced veterans that they had from fighting Hannibal. So those Roman armies had veteran generals and troops, and they really stomped ass across the Mediterranean. But as time wore on and land became more concentrated, these armies started to suck. Military life was long and brutal for Roman men, who often remained on military tour until the end of the conflict. Not really. They sometimes did remain longer than the year that was originally intended for them. Sometimes they get stuck for a few years. But it was pretty rare that they get stuck for decades. That is not a thing. Sometimes the tours would run over, yes, and be longer than they should be, and that would really hurt the men's ability to run their homesteads. But yeah, decades, no, absolutely not. Leaving fatherless families to scrape out difficult lives from the soil, that is true. And that was at the core of the problem and why a lot of these farmers would come home empty-handed, especially from Spain, where you don't really get much plunder, and then find out their family's bankrupt, and the next move is to sell their land to enable themselves to eat. Rome's forever wars forced many families to sell their farms to wealthy politicians while continuing to work as tenant sharecroppers. If they were lucky, actually. A lot of people ended up just getting booted from their land, especially after Tiberius' time when this problem actually got worse. Over time, this war-forged economy funneled ever larger amounts of wealth and land into the pockets of Rome's top 1%. Not to get too pedantic here, but this is redundant. If you're in the 1%, you're obviously at the top. And it might actually have been a slightly larger demographic than the top 1%. But again, I guess basically this is more or less right. It's in the ballpark. Maybe the top 2 to 3%. Because also the equestrians, who were the prominent businessmen, were doing really well as the Republic expanded. And there were people who were kind of from sub-branches of senatorial families that weren't quite wealthy enough to be in the Senate, but were still very wealthy overall, and who also benefited from this to some extent. The huge tracts of pristine farmland Rome captured during Tiberius' time had those elites salivating over the prospect of new resources to control. The farmland that the Romans were contesting that Tiberius wanted to redistribute were agripublicus lands. These were lands in Italy that had been under the Roman thumb since about 300 BCE. Tiberius is tribune in 133. Some of these lands had also been confiscated from the Italian allies who had revolted back in the Second Punic War. But all of them had been in Rome's domain for decades at this point, at the minimum, if not over a century. So these lands are not newly captured by any stretch of the imagination. There were newly acquired territories abroad, but those were not the ones getting redistributed. That was not the conflict at all. If anything, there was really no opposition to people trying to go out and make a living in the captured territories, except that you needed to have the support of Roman troops to make sure the locals don't just murder you and reclaim their land. So that's why those arenas of land, those areas of land and markets were all dominated by the equestrians, who were becoming stronger vis-a-vis the Senate than previously, and this actually ended up having the effect of making corruption worse, without alleviating poverty at home. So the land that was being acquired had nothing to do with the landless problem in Italy. And Tiberius knew that recruitment occurred in Italy, so if he's trying to do a military recruitment drive, it wouldn't really help his effort to, say, put a bunch of farmers in Spain, where it'd be hard to go recruit them, because all the recruiters came directly out of Rome once they became magistrates. And by the time you recruit men from one area of the empire, guess what? Their term of service might expire, because again, theoretically, it was supposed to only be a year. But in practice, as the author does mention, it could be much longer. Tiberius made land redistribution his tentpole issue. Yes, he did. As tribune of the plebs, he made an amorphous... No, this was a very specific thing. It was not amorphous or vague. An overambitious pledge to redistribute newly captured lands to the soldiers and the poor. Again, the land was not newly captured, and it was to redistribute land that had been illegally occupied by senators and other wealthy people, and then redistribute it to people who needed it. He actually was not trying to reclaim land that had been purchased from people who were in financial hardship, which would have been a more radical step and would have also had the same effect as his bill. But what he was trying to do is take a more conservative tact about it, because he couldn't really contest the legal rights of people who had purchased mortgages. But what he could do is contest the legal right of people who had occupied land that they technically had no title to, meaning the public land. So, legally speaking, this was the safe route. And his opponents had no real counter to this, by the way. They couldn't really justify their occupation of the land except to say, well, we've had it occupied for a generation now. I mean, my daddy did it, so therefore I can do it too, I guess. That was literally their argument. I mean, and that's why they just wanted to shut this down from the outset, because debating it would be an embarrassment. They can't justify it. Tiberius's Lex Sempronia Agraria proclamation was every bit as captivating among his supporters as Donald Trump's chants to build a wall are today. Those two things are not analogous. And also, Tiberius's plan really does play on something tangible. Whereas Trump supporters who support building the wall are looking for benefits that will come down the line later. The idea is that if you cut off immigration, there are more opportunities here for people, and that eventually this will pay out in some way. Tiberius Gracchus was offering land to people who had lost their land and were looking to rebuild their family farms. And also, the elite argument, the elite version of it would be, now we have more people we can recruit, so that way we can continue to conquer stuff and bring honor to our families and put our names in the pages of history on the backs of Roman farmers. Trump, in this case, is a lot different. And also, Trump, I guess the one analogy between these two very different pieces of legislation is that most elites are actually against the wall because the elites who are more left-aligned think that it's a cruel punishment for people who have done nothing wrong, and then people who are more corporate-aligned think that the wall is something which will impede the flow of cheap labor into America. So both of them have a small number of elites around them, opposed to a larger number of elites, but for very, very different reasons. And in fact, the politics of immigration in America are far more complicated than Tiberius's politics around the Sempronian law. If I had to find a better parallel between Tiberius and Trump when it comes to passing legislation or a chant, I would say the thing that comes the closest to being analogous with Tiberius's land law would be Trump's promise to bring manufacturing jobs back to America by utilizing tariffs and doing things of that nature. Because he's hearkening back to an era that people remember and sort of offering them back a lifestyle that they haven't enjoyed in a few decades, but that people either remember or have heard about from relatives and friends, and that really appeals to their sensibilities. So, if anything, that would be a better analogy, I think. But the build a wall thing, not as much. Not to mention that also bringing back manufacturing jobs would also have the impact of extending the American dream and the middle-class lifestyle to a larger number of people, which would be similar to the lifestyle that you get from having a small farm as opposed to being a day laborer in Rome or Capua or one of the other cities of Italy. Tiberius Gracchus hid from the public a more kleptocratic reality. Much of the people's land would in fact be distributed to the Gracchi family and to his personal clients. Absolute bullshit. Complete lie. That is 110% false. The people who would be overseeing the distribution would be loyalists to Tiberius who shared his vision. The land commission would be Tiberius, his father-in-law, and his younger brother, Gaius. So in that sense, I guess you could say that it was a bit chummy and maybe even a bit nepotistic. But the idea was to take land from senators who had occupied it illegally and then give it to people who needed it. This was not to enrich the Gracchi directly. Now, if you think about the politics of clientage, the idea of the Gracchi building a political power base, then yes, they would be gaining supporters because people who had farms because of them would almost certainly back them in every election and back their friends in every election. So in that way, it was self-serving. I mean, let's not pretend the Gracchi are not politicians because they most certainly are, but this is not the same as just literally taking land. And this is not comparable to, say, Trump encouraging foreign ambassadors to stay in his hotels and go to his golf courses to make sure that his family business continues to make money. The Gracchi benefit indirectly, but not directly. Very different. And also keep in mind that rules about corruption in the past are not the same as in the present. So, that's important. In 134 BC, a fight broke out at one of Tiberius' political rallies. A contio is not quite a rally, it's more of an address where he hears out people and then expresses his intentions. But he's not out there seeking to get elected, which is what most rallies are about today. Although I'm not too worried about that term. I think rally is close enough. And a mob dragged a fellow tribune named Octavius from the stage after he stood in opposition to some of Tiberius' more extreme proposals. Or actually, no, a contio would be more informal like a rally, and what Tiberius was doing was an actual formal assembly trying to pass legislation. One of his colleagues tried to pass a tribunician veto, and Tiberius had him removed effectively. Now, Octavius was someone who represented the Senate's interest, or at least that conservative faction of the Senate, and because the Roman system was heavier on checks than balances, 1 out of the 10 tribunes could, in theory, fuck up everything for the other 9. So, Octavius was in the way. Tiberius moved him aside because he understood that this was just obstructionism. And technically, yes, this is illegal, and this is a mark against Tiberius, constitutionally speaking. This is the first time he's done something that is legitimately objectionable. So finally, at long last, the conservative faction, I've been calling them optimates, although it is technically anachronistic, because just like the term populares, optimates don't fully emerge until the time of Sulla. Anyway, yes. Octavius got removed. He was not beaten, however. Modern comparisons may not serve this moment well because the bodily integrity of a Roman tribune was held in the highest legal, religious, and cultural regard. They were sacrosanct. You could not harm them, lay hands on them. I don't think that literally means you can't touch them, though. You just can't, like, punch them or slap them or whatever. But I don't think there was a rule against going up and shaking their hand or escorting them by, grabbing their arms and then tugging gently. So I don't think that most of the people there would want to incur the religious penalties. Because again, most Romans believed that it would be an offense in the eyes of the gods to harm a tribune. So I imagine that the crowd was much less violent towards Octavius than this article seems to think. It would be worse than punching the Queen of England. Yes, it would, actually, because it would be an offense against the gods, and it might call a pox down upon your house. But again, you know why the tribunes had that right. It's because they were responsible for standing up for the people. So Tiberius actually probably could justify this by saying, it is my sacred duty to stand up for the interests of the people. And one of the tribune's duties is to stand in the forum, and if a pleb comes up to them and says, help me, I'm being oppressed, and another official is trying to beat one of them, the tribune can intercede and stand in front of this person and prevent him from taking any hits. So the tribunes literally exist on a day-to-day basis to make sure that Roman citizens are not physically and otherwise abused, and that they get some degree of fair treatment. Octavius's public humiliation ignited a powder keg of resentment between the glacial Senate and a populace eager to drain the swamps and build their new Tiberius promised hopes on top of it, or homes. No. The thing is, you couldn't really vote out senators. Senators became senators for life, pretty much, and the only people who got rid of them were censors, who were senior senators, had to be well entrenched in the organization and popular to get to that point. Drain the swamp is basically just the same thing as vote the bums out, and that only makes sense in a system where you can eliminate somebody from the Senate. Now, voters could potentially deny someone a higher office, but there was no way the voters could actually vote someone out of the Senate. So there was no possibility of draining the swamp in the modern sense. And there also was no bureaucracy, so there's no way to start some sort of campaign or elect somebody who would go and gut some federal agency that you don't like. So the drain the swamp idea is not doable. Also, the equestrian order, which was the equivalent of the lobbyist order of today, that was also basically untouchable because most Romans, most common Romans, didn't really have a clear understanding of how their politics worked, as far as we can tell. And so they would not have even known who to go after. Not to mention that a lot of the Romans did their business on estates outside of the city or indoors inside of their large mansions where no one could really do anything about it. So no one really had any notion of draining the swamp. And also the Roman people, despite having dissatisfaction with outcomes, tended to be pretty content with voting for people with famous names, whether those were high-ranking plebeians like Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus, or patricians such as Publius Cornelius Sulla or Gaius Julius Caesar. So, draining the swamp is not something that the Romans ever thought about doing, because it just wasn't either possible or really conceivable. The threat of removal from office proved too much for Tiberius to bear. In a desperate attempt to fend off his legal jeopardy. Let's see if... Okay. So this skipped a little bit. He should have explained that the Senate then tried to have Tiberius removed as tribune, rather than just saying the threat of it and then moving forward from there. So again, a small error in composition, but pretty minor. But again, Max, you get 2 weeks per article, and you write constantly, pretty easily correctable error. I mean, I can give you a little bit of a pass for being a bit fuzzy on Roman history, since that's not what you do. And most of this is not to really chastise the authors so much as it is to inform my listeners. Although I enjoy chastising the authors, but that's just for fun, pretty much. The threat of removal from office proved too much for Tiberius to bear. In a desperate attempt to fend off his legal jeopardy, Tiberius made an unprecedented decision to seek an illegal successive term in office. Pause. Unprecedented, yes. Illegal, no. Now, the Romans could claim that this is against mos maiorum because no one else would think to do that, but the reason no one else did it is not because it was illegal, but rather because they saw the tribuneship as a stepping stone to higher offices. And by running for tribune again, you're not only taking up a spot that someone else could fill, but you're also delaying your own advancement. So when he does it again, even if he hadn't been a disruptive tribune in any way, it would still been weird, but illegal, no. There was no rule against this. It's just something people didn't do. And you can argue whether that's good or bad. I guess it depends on how much you value norms and values, as they're called now. I tend to be somewhere towards the low middle range of thinking that they're important. But again, he did not violate any law. The Roman Constitution was rather vague. It's not written down. There aren't clauses of it. It is basically just a way that people practice government. By Roman standards, for instance, the shifting of the speakership of the House from party to party based on who has a majority automatically would count as part of the Constitution, although technically it is not, because our Constitution doesn't include political parties. Those are just customs that have been built around us having a party system. For the Romans, the distinction between custom and law was less clear. But unless there was a solid statute on the books, it was not illegal. So it's one of those areas where we always have to operate in ambiguity, because our categories of analysis are not the same as the Romans. It was an audacious power grab. For the time, sort of. But again, I mean, people did stuff like this all the time in Rome. All the Romans were power hungry, and the people who tried to silence Tiberius by putting Octavius up to being a check against him, or by sort of low-key threatening him with violence, I mean, is that not a power grab? Isn't Rome supposed to be about discourse, debate, and voting by representation? I mean, couldn't you argue the same, that the Senate had engaged in an audacious power grab? I mean, senators occupied land they had no title to, and defended their right to do so shamelessly, even when they had no right. So, we're talking about audacious power grabs. I mean, shit, Tiberius can't really be singled out as the only person doing this, even for a citizenry already accustomed to Tiberian legal excesses and excuses. At this point, he hadn't really done that much, though. I mean, what? And he hasn't even mentioned the Land Commission, which was the only thing that can really count as an overreach in the eyes of the Senate, because that was the Land Commission where they redistributed the Agri Publicus, but this author has not actually mentioned that by name. But that was actually the most important thing Tiberius did. And part of the reason why he runs for re-election is to make sure that it stays in place. Ironically, Tiberius' death at the hands of the Senate will really make his land commission become more untouchable. Because now the people will be willing to riot if that gets taken out. So actually, if they had allowed Tiberius to run another term unopposed and just let him be in office, they might have had a much better chance of dismantling the land commission. But we'll get there when we get there. The Senate, surrounded, made an attempt to throw Tiberius out. It was too little, too late. Years of free reign allowed Tiberius to crater public support in institutions like the criminal courts. Okay, this is going way off the rails here, and the timeline's off. So I noticed earlier he said 134 when he meant 133. Tiberius's tribuneship was 1 year. It was the year 133. There were no years of free reign. There was a year, and it was not free reign. Tiberius tried for the first few months to get the Senate to act, and they wouldn't. And even then, it wasn't free reign. I mean, they opposed him at every step. What years of free reign were there? And how was he cratering support for public institutions? He was trying to revive the prestige of the People's Assembly. And in terms of the criminal courts, to the best of my knowledge, they did not try to bring a criminal case against him. At least I don't recall reading about that. So it's not like he threatened a court, which is something that was known to happen in Roman politics. But also, trying to criminally prosecute political opponents is something that really picks up a little later. I don't think it was quite as common in this particular period. It was also common in the wake of the Second Punic War, people to go after each other in court. But to the best of my knowledge, this was not something that people tried to do against Tiberius, because they realized, low-key, he hadn't really violated any statutes. It was kind of hard to pin down exactly what his offense was. Sapped from within by division, the Senate found itself unable to control even the execution of its own laws. This makes no sense as a sentence. Because the way he's trying to set it up is that it was Tiberius versus the Senate. One man against the world. Just like Trump by himself, supposedly, against the entire political establishment. Never mind that he actually has supporters, especially within the Republican Party, who are mostly there to milk the teats of his popularity, but, do end up supporting him in meaningful ways. It's not as if Tiberius had no friends. This guy, again, had an ex-consul and his father-in-law who was an avid supporter. So, yeah. And the Senate always had divisions within it. It's not as if the Senate was some body that, up to Tiberius Gracchus, functioned without any friction whatsoever. This was a competitive, bloodthirsty political arena. Tiberius and others competed hard for power and for prestige. The idea that they didn't is delusional. The idea that this only originated with Tiberius Gracchus is insane. The Senate was always divided. There were always conflicts between people over who got commands, who got governorships, who got credit for this law or that. Finally, free of rules Tiberius had rendered obsolete, the Senate assembled its own violent mob. Pause. Did Tiberius render all the rules obsolete by just reverting to using the People's Assembly? No. And also, if you are trying to stand for the traditional order, why would you give up on it after less than a year? Because remember, another thing to keep in mind, actually Tiberius' supposed reign of absolute anarchy, this would have been maybe 9 months total. Because usually elections take place 3 or so months before the next annual magistrates take office. So Tiberius is seeking a second term. He's not even a year into his term. So the Senate, by Burns' reckoning, completely abandoned all of its principles within 9 months. It's almost as if maybe they didn't believe what they were doing. Led by the Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome's civic religion, senators attacked Tiberius in the assembly. The chief leader of them was actually a man named Scipio Nasica, who was the descendant of Scipio's brother. No, excuse me, not Scipio's brother, Scipio Asiaticus, but rather Scipio's uncle, Scipio Calvus, the general from the Second Punic War, tends to be overshadowed by his nephew, but was absolutely instrumental to the war's final outcome. A guy who I'm a big fan of. Some, lacking knives, swung clubs fashioned from the legs of shattered senatorial benches. Only a few refused to participate in the murder. Citation needed. We actually don't know how many Senate supporters refrained from violence. If anything, it was probably an outraged minority who felt confident enough to engage in that. And the only senator who was out there doing this in person was Scipio Nasica, who then became so hated in Rome that he had to leave into exile. And the people who defended the murder of Tiberius and later Gaius, some of them ended up dying mysteriously, and there are people who suspect that commoners poisoned them out of spite. After his death, Tiberius' younger brother Gaius succeeded him as tribune. This is literally 10 years later, by the way, so keep that in mind. The popularities weren't going away. The slow corrosion Tiberius set in motion continued to spread until the Republic's final collapse under Caesar at the Rubicon, almost a century later. The corrosion was that Rome was expanding, its needs were changing, and the senatorial elite would not respond to that. That was the corrosion. Now, some of the reformers were self-serving and crooked in their own ways, but ultimately the reformers were more on the side of right than their opponents because they realized that they had to change with the times. They had to adapt. And most of the people who refused to adapt did so because they were corrupt and they were more worried about both the approval of their friends and also their own personal wealth and power than they were with the Roman state. Tiberius demolished Rome's high-minded belief in the sustaining power of political customs and traditions. Asterisk. We assume those things existed before 133. We don't exactly know. Because again, Romans' lives had been getting materially worse, at least common Romans, for a generation or two by that point. They were sort of at the same point materially that we are when it comes to dealing with the neoliberal era right now, where incomes have been fairly stagnant, the standard of living has been declining. So, yeah, if anything, we don't really know that people were all about their institutions at that moment. And Tiberius, if anything, was no more creating this discontent than Trump. That would be one parallel you might be able to draw between them. The discontent existed. And Tiberius was not necessarily trying to stoke that discontent. He was actually trying to plug the dam. He wasn't trying to exploit it. If that makes sense. I mean, he wanted to fix the problem, not to take advantage of the problem to gain power. In a few minutes of violent fury, the Senate had proven Tiberius right. Norms that had protected the Republic from strongman authoritarianism for years had shattered. Rebuilding them proved too costly. So this is basically victim blaming. So because Tiberius pissed off the Senate when they murdered him, that set the ball in motion for everything to go to shit. So why don't they have any responsibility here? Where's their culpability? I mean, and ironically, again, because given that this guy is a Democratic strategist, he doesn't realize it, but he is recreating a Republican argument about how Obama is to blame for racial tension because he made white people uncomfortable. So, I mean, again, he's reproducing the logic of that argument without knowing it. Daily Beast. Good lord. Yeah, I miss the days when I was ignorant enough to think that Daily Beast had some good content here and there. Jesus. Now it's so hard to find anything I can read without rolling my eyes. American institutions may appear stronger than those of the Roman Republic, but our unwillingness to use the Constitution to protect our country against Donald Trump's new popularities will set us on the same grim path. So, this is interesting because I think Max Burns is identifying the optimates with the Democrats and then the Republicans with the populist faction, which doesn't make a hell of a lot of sense. Because traditionally, the Democrats, at least up until the time of Bill Clinton, mostly represented the working class. Yeah, this is crazy shit. And he's also calling for using the Constitution. What does that mean here? Speaker Pelosi's decision to begin impeachment hearings is a reassuring step. But again, she should have gone after emoluments, not Russia. Emoluments was more provable. And if you honestly do believe, as a Democrat, that Donald Trump was in collusion with Russia and a threat to national security and the survival of humanity and all the other things people said, the point is not to get him out of office on the most spectacular charge, but to get him out of office by any means necessary. Because again, if you honestly believe that he is undermining America, that should be your number one priority. Not doing it in a stylized manner that is unnecessary. So a serious lack of seriousness on the part of Pelosi and others. Now the Senate must set aside partisanship and rise to this serious moment. That will never happen. The Senate is literally incapable of doing that. Let's be honest about it. That is not what the Senate does. And also, I don't know if that's analogous to... So basically he thinks the Roman Senate did the right thing by killing Gracchus, but also that put them on a path to destruction. So we should kill Trump or get rid of him by questionable means. Keep in mind this article was written in 2019 when Trump was still president. So we should get rid of Trump by any means necessary, and then that will seal our fate, but it'll be the right thing to do, I guess. Fuck. The risk of long-term or permanent damage to our institution grows daily. Literally, the corollary of the arguments that he's made so far about Roman history means that no matter what we do, the damage is basically set in stone at this point. And what he's calling for would effectively make Trump a martyr and give Trump a long lineage after him of people who were trying to do Trumpian things, which would eventually result in a Julius Caesar figure. So the logic here doesn't work. It really doesn't. It's when strong governments refuse to protect themselves, when they bow to the siren song of false populism, that we fall short of our national values. And based on what he said about populism so far, I have no clue if this guy actually knows what a true populist would be, or if he thinks all populism is inherently false. I get the sense he might be kind of an elitist. I don't know. It's unclear exactly where he's coming from here. Tiberius Gracchus and Donald Trump have been beguiling us with two echoes of the same dangerous song. No. Again, very, very, very different men, very, very, very different methods, very, very, very different pieces of legislation that they're trying to pass. Tiberius also was nothing like Trump. He was young. He was only 29 or 30 at the time. He was handsome. He was charismatic. He was dignified. He came from a family that was politically well connected. He was a fairly traditional politician in a lot of ways. He tried to go through the traditional channels. He claimed to be representing tradition and restoring a lost order. Trump is old, fat. He has a bad reputation. He is not respected by other members of the ruling elite. He is not dignified. He's willing to do anything for money. He made his presidential name by having a Twitter following. He is known for being crass. That's where he got his supporters. So Trump is the opposite of Tiberius Gracchus, even stylistically. When we talk about substance, again, Tiberius Gracchus was operating within legal means and trying to hold the elite to account.
Trump was trying to rally anger against some groups of the elite and then some other groups, such as immigrants, in order to get people riled up to vote for him. And then once he had that power, he abandoned his populist motivations and instead just cut taxes for rich people and then stuck his thumb up his ass and then bungled COVID. So, yeah, these are very different leaders, and also Trump was on the national scene way longer than Tiberius Gracchus. Gracchus, again, had maybe 9 months in office, and he was not the chief executive of Rome. The tribunes are not at the top of the pyramid. So, yeah, the analogy is a dumb one. It makes no sense. There's still time to tune Trump out. We've been trying. Doesn't seem to be working. So, anyway, that was interesting. I still have a couple more I will do going forward. I'll probably do this one on the top 10 worst American generals with Sean, since that's his field. This list is awful. There are even points I could make about it. Another one someone sent me, which seems fascinating, is the idea that Tiberius used quantitative easing. And while I was doing research for this video, I stumbled upon some other things comparing Trump with Romans, especially Gaius Gracchus, but here I found Ross Douthat from the New York Times, who compared Trump to Crassus, which is also a common one that I haven't covered yet. So this will probably be the next one I do, the Trumpiest Roman of them all. I guess we'll find out if Ross makes an argument or not. We'll see. I'll probably do this next week, early sometime. Maybe I'll try to replicate this time if you guys like this. Or I might try for Tuesday. I guess we'll see. I'll make that determination later. But I would like to reread Plutarch's Life of Crassus before I do this, because it's been a while since I've read about Crassus. So, anyway, let's see. I guess that's about all I have for you today. Looks like we got a super chat somewhere. Let's go back and find it. Here they are. Nicholas, thank you. $5 Canadian. Elagabalus smiles down on you, my son. Elagabalus smiles upon you as well. And he smiles upon all under the sun, because he is the God that we all need and the hero we all deserve. Darren Murphy, £5. Thank you, Darren. Appreciate the vids that keep me entertained at work. How would history have played out if Athens had won the Peloponnesian War? Also, Jeb Bush equals Lepidus. Let me try something real fast. Hang on for a second. Let's see if that fixed the mic. I don't know what's been going on with it lately. I hope this mic doesn't break, because if it does, I'll be kind of fucked, because I can't really afford to replace it anytime soon. This was like $120 or $30. Okay, so we already read that. How would history have played out differently if Athens had won the Peloponnesian War? That's a good question. I've thought about that a fair amount. I don't honestly know. I don't think that they had it within them to really knock out the Spartans in a meaningful way. They could have defeated them by detaching some of their allies and then forcing Sparta to the table. That might have had some pretty devastating impacts on Sparta long term. I think that if Athens had been encouraged by such a victory, they may have kept overplaying their hand and eventually met with a similar fate to what happened in 404. I don't think they would have really learned that much of a lesson, if we're being completely honest about it. That being said, it also would have put a lot of pressure on Persia, because this would have kept up Athenian pressure in the east, especially if they had broken up some of the Peloponnesian League and then had more resources to focus out east. Thebes or Corinth still might have risen up at some point, and then that might have been the rivalry that broke out later. Athens also would have been much better positioned to keep Macedon in line, so the rise of Macedon either might not have happened or it might have taken longer. So, those are definite possibilities. Also, Jeb Bush equals Lepidus. Well, I actually think Lepidus was more able than Jeb Bush, but I can definitely see some reason for comparison. I mean, Lepidus in retrospect does appear a little bit laughable, but he did have some staying power, because he got pardoned by Octavian and retained the title of Pontifex Maximus until his death. And also, he was a fairly competent general when he served under Caesar. So, if anything, he's kind of the Platonic form of Jeb Bush. He's what Jeb Bush dreamt of becoming. Let's see if we can find the other one. Shit. I guess I got lost in the flow. Yeah, I wanted to get through the things before we got too far along. Let's see. Nicholas. No, here's another Nicholas. Okay. Nicholas, $5 Canadian, denounce Julia Misa or your lands will be ransacked. I mean, she betrayed the greatest emperor ever, so yeah, she is the greatest criminal in all of history, safe to say. I mean, if she had just allowed her grandson to continue working for Rome's best interest, then Rome would still exist to this day undiminished. Okay, let's see. Anything else here? Okay. Alright, did that fix it? The mic, I mean? Alright, well, I need to go now. We need to take our puppy on a walk, but it has been a pleasure seeing you all this afternoon. And I will come back sometime next week, perhaps, to do something like this again. I'll probably try a later start date next time, because it looks like, well, no, we got a pretty good crowd today. Not bad at all, so I might try to do it at the same time again next week, probably on Tuesday. And I'll probably try the Trumpiest Roman of them all. That should give me enough time to read up on Lepidus again. Or not Lepidus, I've got Lepidus on the brain now, Crassus. So, because this is one of the more common analogies that I see, and apparently the Gaius Gracchus comparison, that's something that at least a few people have tried. So, one day I might actually try to assemble all the Gaius Gracchus ones into some sort of omnibus package of Gaius Gracchus comparisons with Trump, because it seems like that has become a go-to analogy for whatever reason. And I guess Gaius is a better analogy than Tiberius, but it's still pretty bad, so that could be interesting. Anyway, I'm Thersites the Historian. Stay tuned. This Sunday, Sean and I will be looking at the presidency of one George H.W. Bush, Bush 41, Bush Sr., and I hope you all can join us then. It'll be at the same time and place, 11 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Until then, I will see you around. This has been Thersites the Historian. Like, comment, subscribe. Hit up my Patreon. All of that happy horse shit. Good day to you all.